All right, welcome to the lesson 3 in the Bible Ends Geography series. This one's going to be about Galilee. And we discovered after the fact that we were not recording on Sunday when we presented this, so we are re-recording it. So I'm sitting in an audio booth with my notes and the PowerPoint, so you're not going to see me, but you will see the PowerPoint. We're going to skip the map drawing and we're going to skip the quiz and dive right into the lesson. If you have a Bible with maps in it, I would encourage you to pull it out and look at the Sea of Galilee. When we did it for the Sunday school class period, we actually drew a map of the Sea of Galilee. It kind of looks like an oblong oval. I think it kind of looks like an ice cream cone at the bottom and then a scoop of ice cream on the top. And if you kind of look at the map at the 9 o'clock position, if you think of it as a clock face, 9 o'clock we have the city of Magdala. 10 o'clock is called Tabgha. 11 o'clock Capernaum, and then about 12:30, 1 o'clock is Bethsaida. And then over at the 3 o'clock position is the city of Corazin. And then down below Magdala, around the 7 o'clock position, is the city of Tiberius. And so the Sea of Galilee is about 12 miles long, 6 miles wide. Very important in the ministry of Christ, and we're going to see that in just a minute here. It is surrounded by very steep terrain on all sides. It's like a bowl shape, mountains everywhere, and sometimes and we know this from the Bible story as well as from actual, from history and people living around there, that when the winds come, they sweep down the side of the mountains and can very quickly turn the Sea of Galilee into a tempest. The Sea of Galilee is also known by other names such as Chinnereth, Gennesaret, Sea of Tiberius. 2/3 of Christ's ministry was in this area. And as we pointed out in a previous lesson, I think the first one, we looked at where some of the major travel routes, kind of like the highways or freeways of their day in Bible days, was located, and one of them came from over along the Mediterranean coast and then would cut across and then right through the Magdala and Capernaum, Bethsaida area, and then branch up north to Damascus, and then actually from there down into Babylon. So there's a lot of trade and a lot of travel coming through this area. It's very international. Take your Bible and go to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 25. Excuse me, verse 12. We're going to read 12 through 25. And I just want you to notice, to me it's fascinating how often in the Gospels these very specific place names are used. And we find the same thing in the Old Testament when the Israelites were coming into the land of Canaan. Lots and lots and lots of place names, and then and some of them don't exist today, or we can't tell exactly where they were located. It's interesting. The city of Emmaus, for instance, there's like 4 or 5 different locations that could be the Bible city of Emmaus. We don't know exactly. But there are others that today is the same location as it was through the time of Christ. And we're going to look at some of those in the Galilee area today. But looking here at verse 12, it says, "Now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee." So he left the Judean, Jerusalem area and traveled up to Galilee area. And it says, leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum. Now, Nazareth is where he was born and where he was raised, and it seems to indicate he left that as being his primary residence, and Capernaum became his new dwelling place, which is upon the seacoast in the borders of Zebulun and Nephthalim, that it might be fulfilled, which is spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Nephthalim, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan. Now get this, it says Galilee of the Gentiles. Now I'd like for you to underline that phrase, Galilee of the Gentiles. Because, you know, honestly, growing up, I mean, I grew up in Christian home and church and Bible college, and I just always thought that the whole land of Israel was Jewish. And I thought that Jesus was always ministering in Jewish areas, and that it was the disciples later, like Paul, who ministered to the Gentiles. But it is significant that this area of Galilee was a very Gentile area. And it's because of all the trade that came through that area and people settling in that area. So Galilee of the Gentiles, the people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up. So obviously that is a quote from the Old Testament, and Jesus was the fulfillment of that. Jumping down to verse 18, Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee saw two brethren, Simon called Peter, Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. So this is the significant location where Jesus called these first couple of disciples. He said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And they straightway left their nets and followed him. And going on from thence, he saw other two brethren, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in a ship with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. And they immediately left the ship and their father and followed him. So now he has these four disciples following him, and it says Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing all manner of sickness, all manner of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria. So now we talked about that in a previous lesson, and that's, you know, further to the north. And they brought in all sick people that were taken with diverse diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. And look at verse 25. And there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis. Now, Decapolis was an area of 10 Greek cities. We're going to talk about one of them in the lesson today, Greek-Roman cities, and from Jerusalem and from Judea and from beyond Jordan. So from this entire region, people heard about Christ, came and heard him, and he as well traveled, says, throughout all Galilee and was teaching in their synagogues. To the far, well, I guess I don't have a map here to show you, but on the eastern side of the lake was the area called the Gadarenes, and that's where the pagan Gentiles lived, and we're going to see that a little bit later when we talk about Cursey. Let's talk briefly about what's called the Jesus boat. During a drought, it was revealed, and this was in 1987, in the mud on the shoreline. It took a team 12 days working day and night to remove this boat from the mud. And then it was a real challenge to keep the wood from drying out and cracking as they dug it out of the mud. So they were constantly spraying it down and scraping away the mud. They also found an oil lamp, an arrowhead, a clay cooking pot. And all of these things confirmed that this was from the era or the time period when Christ lived and was ministering there in Galilee. Now, it's not, nobody is saying this was the actual boat that Christ was in, but it does give some clues about what the boat probably was, how it was constructed, the size of it, that kind of a thing. How to transport such a delicate artifact, 27 feet long, 8 feet wide. They decided to coat it in fiberglass insulation, and then they floated it and took it to a location where they soaked it in a chemical preservative for 7 years. Today, this ancient Galilee boat is on display, and now many tourists and guests coming to that area are able to see what they call the Jesus boat. And they've made similar boats in size and taken people out on the water. Here's a picture of one of those types. And you just get to experience being out on the water and realizing this is the same Sea of Galilee that Christ was on with his disciples, and kind of think through some of the Bible stories that we know took place on the Sea of Galilee. Let's move next to the city of Nazareth. Of course, Nazareth is most famous for being the hometown of Christ when he was growing up. And in Luke chapter 1 and verse 26, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, and the virgin's name was Mary. So the Annunciation came in this town of Nazareth. Jesus would have grown up here. His first message that he preached, his first sermon was here. He was called a Nazarene, and that is because he was from this particular town. Today it is a bustling Arab city, very, very busy, and there's not a lot to see. There's not a lot of historical things. There are a couple of churches, but it has become a very modern city. Another landmark in the area of Galilee is this cone-shaped mountain called Mount Tabor. And some have identified it as being perhaps where Christ ascended. We believe it was actually up in Caesarea Philippi, as we talked about in the previous lesson. This is famous actually for the story in Judges 4 where Barak defeated Sisera and needed Deborah's help. And so she said, I'll go with you, but I'm going to let you know that you are not going to kill the final, the general Sisera. A woman is going to kill him. And you remember the story that Sisera fled into a tent, and a lady named Jael used a nail and thrust it through his temples and killed Sisera. But in the Bible story, if you look at Judges 4, I'm not going to take time to go back and read the story, but they were up at the top of that mountain looking down, and Sisera and his hosts were huge, and they just had a small group of the Israelites, but they came down the side of the mountain and started pursuing after Sisera, and from what we can tell, there was a tremendous rainstorm, and the ground was muddy, and the river was overflowing, and so the enemy of ended up being stuck and were able to be defeated, and of course God brought the victory. So Mount Tabor is famous for that. Let's talk about the city of Cana. The site is very close to Nazareth, and today is just an archaeological site, and there's nobody living there. It's about 4 miles northeast of Nazareth. Some of the significant things that happened here, one is that Jesus healed the nobleman's son. Now the nobleman was actually from Capernaum and had built the synagogue there, but he came to Cana and found Jesus and asked him to heal his son. Let's go to John, John chapter 21. And I want you to notice another significant thing that I didn't know until I was studying for these lessons. John 21, verses 1 and 2. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberius. So that's another name for the Sea of Galilee, because Tiberius was the major city on the coast of Galilee. And on this wise, he showed himself. There were together Simon, Peter, Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee and the 2 other disciples. So we know from this verse that Nathanael was actually from Cana of Galilee, and I think it's interesting that back when Nathanael was called, he said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Nazareth was actually like the closest town to to Cana. So to me, I kind of view it like these are 2 arch rivals, right across from each other. Phillipsburg and Easton, Pennsylvania, arch football rivals. And I don't know, maybe they had some sport that they played. But anyways, Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Talking about Christ. So this is where Jesus turned the water into wine. His disciples were with him, and they saw that and believed on him, it says, after that miracle in Cana. Now, if we move down to the coast, like at the 9 o'clock position on the Sea of Galilee, is this city of Magdala. We don't know a lot about it, except that Mary Magdalene's name is derived from this place, and she was a devout follower of Jesus. The picture shown here is actually, if you were standing at Magdala looking back towards the hills of Cana and Nazareth. Tiberius is the major city on the Sea of Galilee. Let's turn to John chapter 6. In verse 23, howbeit there came other boats from Tiberias nigh unto the place where they did eat bread after that the Lord had given thanks. This was a major seaport. It had been built during the time of Herod and named after the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Today it is a site for tourists. This is a view from, obviously, being out on one of those Jesus boats and looking back towards the shore. So today there are a lot of hotels, restaurants, that kind of a thing appealing to tourists who are in the Galilee area. As well, a lot of Israelites, a lot of Jews from southern Israel will travel up, and this is cooler and greener and more lush, and then there's water sports and that kind of a thing that they participate in on the Sea of Galilee. Let's talk next about the city of Bethsaida. This was a fishing town located on the northern shore, kind of at the 1 o'clock position. And this was the original hometown of Peter and Andrew and the sons of Zebedee. We find that in John chapter 1 and verse 44, as well as in Matthew chapter 4. The city has been excavated, and there's a lot of evidence of the fishing industry here, and houses, streets. And in this picture here, if you look to the far right, you'll see an image. And on that image is, you recognize it, a carving of Baal. And this was actually found right here at this site. To the left of it, that stone pillar represents the fact that this was like a gate into the city. In one of the Gospels, I want to say it's in Luke. I don't have it written down here, but this was the actual site, Bethsaida, where Jesus fed the 5,000. And then sent his disciples out on a boat, and he went up into a mountain place to pray, and then came down and calmed the storm. He was walking on the water and calmed the storm. So that was right here at this spot of Bethsaida as well. The next city we want to talk about is Capernaum. And Capernaum was one of the 3 major cities that Jesus ministered in. It's called one of the Jesus towns. It as well was a fishing village. It became the hometown of Peter, and we see that in Mark chapter 1. In fact, I'm going to turn there and just read a couple of those verses. Mark 1 and verse 21 says, They went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. And in verse 29 it says, And forthwith when they came out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John, but Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever. And anon they tell him of her, and he came and took her by the hand, lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. So obviously we can tell from this verse number 1 that Simon had a wife, and he had a mother-in-law, and she was sick. Jesus healed her. And this was right in this town. Now, this is the picture that you see on the screen is a drone view of the city that's been excavated. That big round thing in the middle actually is a Catholic church right over the site that is supposedly the home of Peter and his wife. And then just to the kind of lower right of that white building is a synagogue. Now it's actually been built a little later, but the lower portion of it that has been excavated, that dark portion of rock, has been dated to the time when Christ actually would have been in that area. Another miracle that was performed here was the healing of the man, the palsied man who was let down through a roof. That took place in this city. Demoniac had the demon cast out of him in this city. This was also a major crossroads for travelers, and the Romans set up a toll booth here and collected taxes. This is where Matthew was a tax collector when Jesus called him to be a follower. In Matthew chapter 9, let's just flip over there if you're turning to these verses with me. And Matthew chapter 9 and verse 1, it says, "And he," talking about Jesus, "entered into a ship and passed over and came into his own city." His own city, just an interesting way of describing this city of Capernaum. So this is where Jesus evidently felt was his home during his 3 years of ministry. It's finally believed that this is where Jesus gave the lesson on the bread of life. Oh, one other miracle here, yes, the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead took place in this city of Capernaum. And again, this is another view in the picture of some of the archaeology and diggings that have been done and restored. One of the other cities that Jesus ministered in quite often was the city of Corazin. And it's significant because in Matthew 11, and we're close to that, so let's flip over a couple of pages, Matthew 11 and verse 21. Verse 20, it says, "Then began he to upbraid the cities wherein most of his mighty works were done, because they repented not." So this is how we know this is where Jesus ministered the most. This verse tells us, "Woe unto thee, Corazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which had been done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say unto you, it should be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon at the day of judgment than for you. And thou, Capernaum, which art exalted above heaven, unto heaven, shall be brought down to hell. For if the mighty works which have been done in thee had been done in Sodom, it would have remained unto this day. But I say unto you, it should be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for thee." Now you think about that, that's pretty sobering. And let's just stop and make a spiritual application here. We think of the city of, let's say, Sodom as being a very wicked city, and it truly was. But they did not have the message of the gospel. They did not have Jesus preaching to them repentance and faith as he did in these three cities. And so he's upbraiding or rebuking these cities and saying, if my message, if I had preached in these cities, more of those people would have repented than you have. And then he goes on to say, you are going to be under worse judgment in hell than they will be. Now that's sobering to think that there are degrees of judgment. And the worst judgment is not for the worst sins. Well, unless you want to make the argument, which I think is valid, that the worst sin is rejecting Jesus Christ. And so the more that somebody sits in church and they hear the gospel over and over and over, and they just keep rejecting and rejecting and rejecting it, the harder their punishment will be than for the person who has never heard the gospel. So if you're watching this presentation today and you're just watching it for the history aspect, and you have never received Christ as your Savior, I urge you to seek after the Lord. You do not want to be joining the ranks of Corazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum, who will be under greater judgment because you've rejected Christ in that day of judgment. Now, this city of Tabgha is not, the name is not mentioned in the Bible. And I have here on the slide is the site of the feeding of 5,000. Actually, I think it's more likely the feeding of the 4,000, which was a second incident. But they commemorate it here anyways. This church was built to commemorate that and to commemorate the Beatitudes that Christ gave in the Sermon on the Mount. And this hillside right to the side of that church kind of shows how Jesus could have very easily been down by the water, and people could have been seated by the thousands on that hillside, and he could have preached to them, and his voice would have carried. And the people would have been overlooking the sea and even trying to push him to the point that he got into a boat, as you recall, and had to preach from the boat. And then when he was done, pushed away. This location is also where it is believed that Jesus came after the resurrection, and the disciples had been out fishing, and then he called them up to the shore and had breakfast ready for them, and then called to Peter and said to him, "Lovest thou me more than these?" pointing to the fish, and then recommissioned Peter to the work that he should be doing for him. So we don't know exactly, but that's where they commemorate it as being in this city. You might see, if you look at a map, you might see this city of Tabgha labeled on a map, but it's up close to Capernaum. Then across the Sea of Galilee on the eastern shore, about the 3 o'clock position, is this city called Corazin, and this is where Jesus with his disciples went on a mission trip into definitely pagan Gentile area. And they, in the caves, which is where they buried people, the tombs, they found the demoniac who then Jesus healed, sent the demons, remember, into the pigs. And the pigs, as Pastor Doug Hammett would like to say, committed suicide as they raced down and into the water and drowned in the Sea of Galilee. But Jesus came back later, and this man who had been healed, as you remember, had gone into town and shared his testimony and told people about Jesus. So when Jesus came back, the people were anxious to hear him, and came, and many were saved. And again, this is a reminder that Jesus was not just trying to minister to the Jews, but this was a pagan Gentile that Jesus reached out to. I want to just insert that this interesting note that I just learned this week in studying for this lesson, and that is, notice in red labeled to the right there, it says Geshur. Okay, that area on the eastern shore is mentioned in the Old Testament. Absalom's mother was here. I'm going to turn back and read that verse in 2 Samuel. In chapter 3 and verse 3 it says, verse 2, unto David were born sons in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. So we know she was from Jezreel Valley. Remember that? And his second, Chileab, of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. So on Mount Carmel, remember, he was herding sheep there, and she saved the life of her family. And then when Nabal died, then David married her. And the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. So from up here in this northern area on the side of the Sea of Galilee was evidently a kingdom, the kingdom of Geshur. In the previous lesson, we learned that this area was also known as Bashan. And his daughter, so Maacah, was the daughter of Talmai, and then she became the mother of Absalom. Now, if you flip over to 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 37 and 38, after Absalom was driven out of the kingdom and fled, it says Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. So again, that's something I learned just in studying for this lesson, that is the area that was being referred to. Let's talk about this city of Beth Shean. And if you look at a map, it's actually on the south side of the Sea of Galilee, and right where the Jezreel Valley empties into or connects with the Jordan Valley. It was a very important strategic city because it was like a gate city. And so there was there have been many, many, many civilizations that have used that strategic spot. Up on that hill, there is evidence of a city, and it's believed that that is where the bodies of Saul and his sons were hung after they died in battle on Mount Gilboa, and were hung there. And then later, some of the Israelites came and took them down and gave them a proper burial, but it was on that wall in Beth Shean. Then in the time of Christ, this was considered one of the Decapolis cities. And today there's a lot of evidence of the Greek and Roman influence. There's amphitheater, there's streets, there's a lot of ceramic tile, mosaics, and bathhouses, and just all kinds of architecture that is reminiscent of the Greek and Roman influence. And even though this town is not mentioned in the time of Christ or in the New Testament, it's very likely that Christ would have traveled through here and very probably preached in this area. The towns of Shunem and Nain are located very close to Nazareth, and this is that picture again of Mount Tabor, but the houses kind of in the foreground at the bottom of the screen are kind of in that area called Shunem and Nain. Remember, the Shunammite woman was the one who created the prophet's chamber that Elijah lived in. And then we know of Nain because there was a widow in Nain whose son Jesus raised from the dead. He was in a casket and was being carried down the street, and Jesus stopped and touched him and raised him from the dead. So those are right, again, here in this area of Galilee. Let's talk finally about this city of Sephoris or Zippori. And it's located to the west of the Sea of Galilee and of Nazareth. And we don't see the name Sephoris in the Bible, but we do know from history that this was the Roman capital of the Galilee region. And so there was a very strong Greek influence in this area. The Hellenistic Jews, they were called, the Greek-influenced Jews were in this area. And this picture to the right is actually, it looks like a woman's face. It is a ceramic tile mosaic that was found in the synagogue in that area. Interestingly, because there was a lot of construction going on around the time that Christ was growing up, this city was being rebuilt by Herod Antipas at the time of Christ's upbringing. It's very likely that Joseph, with his skill as a carpenter, would have been needed in this city. And maybe Joseph traveled there and took with him Jesus and his brothers as apprentices to kind of learn the trade, and they probably traveled here often and worked. We don't know that. We're just kind of imagining that, but it's very, very likely. Let's talk just for a minute here about the disciples, and we'll end this lesson with this thought. You know, the disciples were not all Jews. There were certainly some very zealous Jews among the lot. There were a couple of Gentiles. There was a Canaanite who was among the Jews. But we also know that Jesus took the disciples on several missions trips. We talked about today the one to Corazin, the very pagan area on the eastern shore of Galilee. And Jesus healed the demoniac there. We also know that they traveled all the way up into Tyre in Syria and Phoenicia. They traveled into Caesarea Philippi, and these are, again, very pagan areas and very Gentile. And Jesus wanted his disciples to get the vision that they were to reach all people with the gospel. It was not just a message for the Jews. And throughout the Galilee area, they didn't just go to the big cities. They ministered, it says, in all the villages in that area of Galilee. And so that is a good challenge for all of us to get our vision raised beyond just where we live and see the world and see all people groups as being in need of Christ. So we're going to end the lesson there. And next week, pick up a lesson with the Judean area, and then end with a lesson about Jerusalem. And I trust that this lesson was helpful to you.